I will say earlier this week, everybody's been on vacation. Mike was with the youth group out in the jungle this week somewhere. And Jenny has been on vacation as well as Mark, so it's been a very quiet week here around the office, so I've got to explore the church. And I actually found this device, which I'm going to be using today, which has a couple incredible uses to it. The first one is, as we go along through a PowerPoint presentation, I can actually change the slides from the stage. Even though the computer's up there, I can just point to it and use this as a wireless mouse. The second use for this that I discovered this week is that when I plug that box into the back of Jenny's computer in her office, I can actually sit in my office and through random points in the day, just start pressing buttons. Now, so I will need your help on this. Jenny's gone. I would like to enjoy doing this for at least a week or so. So if when she gets back, if you just maybe don't mention that to her for a little while. But in all seriousness, today I'm excited to preach. We're going to, I hope that a couple things get accomplished today. I hope that we expand our knowledge a little bit of a couple different stories from the Bible that take new meaning to us and that really speak to us. And I hope that we also take this as an opportunity to ask ourselves where we can change, where we can come better, and where we can really work to reach our community. And the responsive reading was from 1 Corinthians 13. And to kind of summarize 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 through 3, it reminds us that to do miraculous acts, acts of prophecy, have great generosity to the poor, even martyrdom itself, if not wrapped in love, if not embraced with proper motive, means nothing. And so today we're going to take a look at what we feel about what we're doing. This is not just simply a message about asking ourselves if we say and do the right things. Today we're going to look at if we feel the right way about what we do, if we think the right way about what we do, and if we have the right motivation behind what we do. We're going to spend the first half looking at some various stories that are very similar in some ways, and yet in other ways they're very different. We're also going to take some time to look at the men or the groups of people that were sent to reach out to those places. And two of the cities we're discussing today come straight from the biblical text, and they both involve a city that's in need of change and a prophet that is sent to start the process. So if you have your Bible, you can turn to Jonah chapter 4. I will be using the New International Version. The text on the screen is going to be from the New International Version. The Bible in front of you is New King James, though, if you prefer that translation. So to start, the book of Jonah is very small. It's only 4 chapters. And for the most part, every person in here knows the first 3 chapters very well. We learned the first 3 chapters of Jonah from the day we were 5 years old. But we'll summarize real quick just so we can get up to Jonah 4, which is where we're going to start. Jonah is a prophet from Israel, and Jonah is at the very beginning of the book called to go to minister to Nineveh. Now, Nineveh is a city we're going to discuss more in a moment, but he's called to go to Nineveh. Jonah does not like Nineveh very much, and he decides to act like a good 12-year-old child, and he pouts about it, and then he runs away. He tells God, this isn't something I'm interested in. And he actually, if you were to look at a map, Jonah is right here, right in the middle of what we would consider the Holy Lands. And he looks at a map and he says, where can I run away to? Well, Jonah runs away to Tarshish, which is actually here in Spain. So Jonah picks the farthest most city on the complete opposite edge of their known world to get away from what God has asked him to do. He gets on a boat, sails across the sea. At some point during his voyage, the storm rises on the sea. Jonah knows almost immediately, this is because of me. This is because I'm running away. He tells the captain and says, Captain, I know why we're under a storm. You should probably just throw me off the boat. And the captain is hesitant, but finally he agrees. They toss Jonah overboard. Jonah's swallowed by a great fish. He spends some time getting acquainted with the fish, sitting in the belly of the fish. After a few days, he is spit ashore right back where he started. And so at this point, Jonah finally says, okay, God, you win. I will do what you ask. And Jonah 3 ends with Jonah going to Nineveh, preaching to the city of Nineveh, and almost immediately, the city of Nineveh converts. The king himself even writes a great prayer of lament to God, apologizing for the sin of the city, and it's a very large miracle. Now, to understand the miracle of Nineveh being converted, I think it's good that we look at Nineveh itself and understand why this was such a big deal. Nineveh was built around 1800 BC. In Genesis chapter 10 is our first mention of Nineveh. Nineveh was built by a man named Nimrod, which for those parents that are having children, if you would like a good biblical name for a son, Nimrod, it's right there in the text. It was built as a port city on 2 rivers. It was built to serve as the trade capital of the Assyrian Empire. If you were to look at a map, Nineveh sits right here in what is now modern-day Iraq. There's 2 rivers. If you look on the left of the screen, the Habor River, there's a river very similar to that right at Nineveh. Nineveh sits right in the middle of the 2. Now, Nineveh, as the large growing city, followed the Assyrian system of mythology. And the Assyrian system of mythology was just like Babylon. It was just like Egypt. It was just like Rome. Basically, that was that anything that happened on the earth or anything that people saw was assigned a god. So the way food grew, the way we ate food, the sun, the moon, everything had a god. And if you were the king of a city, a new city, you basically got to pick one. You picked your favorite. And then that would be the god or the goddess of your city. And so in your city, you would build a temple to that god or goddess, and then your city would function around the principles of that god or goddess. Now, Nineveh definitely picked what they considered to be an exciting god, one that could serve the city. They picked Ishtar. Now, Ishtar was actually the daughter of the god Sin. And I'm not making that up. She served as a goddess for love, fertility, and for sex. And so what that meant is that Nineveh as a culture became a city that was given over to extreme sexuality. Women from when they were very young would be given to the temple to serve as prostitutes in the temple for their entire life up to a certain age. And it became rampant throughout the city. And it was embraced by the city. In addition to this sexuality, the city is also mentioned in historical writings and even the Bible itself as being a very violent city. The city was often at war with itself, in addition to being at war with the people around it. The king himself in Jonah chapter 3 even mentions that violence is one of the great things that God needs to rid the city of. Now, this is all to summarize when we look at Nineveh, that to put it short, this would definitely not be a devout Hebrew prophet's ideal place to buy a timeshare. Now, so Jonah's trepidation toward the city could to some degree be understood then. We could understand Jonah's mislike of the city. We could understand Jonah's fear of the city. We could understand God telling Jonah, or Jonah telling God rather, that I don't want any part of that. But in spite of all of this, Jonah chapter 4 is a critique, and it's not a critique on Jonah's action. It's not a critique on anything Jonah necessarily did. Jonah chapter 4 is a critique on Jonah's attitude and the way he felt about the people of Nineveh. So let's look at that text together, starting in verse 1. But Jonah was greatly displeased and became angry. He prayed to the Lord, "O Lord, is this not what I said when I was still at home? That is why I was so quick to flee to Tarshish. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." But the Lord replied, "Have you any right to be angry?" Now, the first 4 verses serve as Jonah's confession. Now, not a confession of repentance, but simply a confession and an admission of his sin. And Jonah basically admits, God, I get it. I know what I did wrong. I don't want Nineveh to be saved. I don't want Nineveh to be part of Israel. I'm admitting that now. So will you please just kill me? Well, God's answer is to look at Jonah and say, Jonah, do you honestly have a right to be angry? Moving on. Jonah went out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. Then the Lord God provided a vine and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the vine. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed the vine so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than live." But God said to Jonah, do you have a right to be angry about the vine? He said, I do. I am angry enough to die. But the Lord said, you have been concerned about this vine, that you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. But Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. Should I not be concerned about this great city? Now, God teaches Jonah a lesson in this, and the book kind of ends. And so we don't really ever know if Jonah gets it or not. It kind of leaves you hanging there. And it's anybody's guess as to whether or not Jonah receives this message. But God sends a vine to grow up over Jonah. And he points out that Jonah didn't plant it. Jonah didn't have anything to do with it growing, but it grew. This vine grew. And then when something was sent to the vine to kill it, Jonah mourned over the vine because he liked the vine. And then God squarely asked Jonah, Jonah, why do you care about a vine more than you care about a population of people? And the phrase 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, that was a phrase to refer to children. So he says this city has 120,000 children in it, and you care about a vine more than you care about the people in this city. The end of Jonah 4, like we said earlier, again, is not a critique of Jonah's actions. Jonah did the right thing. Jonah went, Jonah preached, the city was saved. God's disapproval of Jonah in that moment was due to his feelings toward the people of Nineveh. Now, later on, we're going to mention Nineveh again and what happens with the city. But we're going to look at a similar situation around 800 years later. So we're going to be in Luke chapter 19, if you would like to turn there. Now, it might seem unfair to compare Jonah to Jesus, but due to some of the similarities in their situation, it's hard not to draw comparisons. Jesus, like Jonah, was sent to minister to a city that was cultural and it was highly populated. It was a capital city. Jerusalem reflected some of the same difficulties that Nineveh did. Jerusalem, in Matthew chapter 23, is mentioned by Christ as being a city that killed the prophets. Matthew chapter 21 refers to Jerusalem as a place where the temple is desecrated. They turned the temple into a glorified flea market. Matthew chapter 23 refers to the religious leaders as those who seek after wealth and position while neglecting the poor and while neglecting faithfulness and obedience. The sick and the poor just served as an annoyance to the upper class. And then most importantly, Jesus knowing this all along, Jerusalem would also serve as the place of Jesus' execution. So this is the Jerusalem that Jesus was dealing with. This is the Jerusalem that Jesus knew of all along. So you could say that Jesus had as many reasons for avoiding or being uncomfortable with the people of Jerusalem as Jonah did with the people of Nineveh. But Jesus' reactions and his attitudes toward the people of Jerusalem was always so much different. And this difference is seen no greater than it is in Luke chapter 19. Now, earlier we read in Jonah that Jonah at one point in his life stood at the top of a city to overlook the city. This is again in Jonah 4. And it says that he looked at the city to see what would happen to the city. He was curious as to what was going to come of Nineveh. Now, in Luke chapter 19, there's a moment very similar with Christ. Jesus is approaching the city of Jerusalem, and he overlooks the city. And in addition to just wondering what would happen with the city, Jesus actually receives a vision of what does happen to the city. So while he is overlooking the city, he sees what is coming for the city. And this is what Jesus sees. 40 years from when Jesus leaves, after he dies and is resurrected, 40 years after he leaves, Rome gets sick of Jerusalem. Rome is sick of Jerusalem, always fighting about paying taxes or not wanting to really be Roman. And Rome says they're sick of it. So they send an army with a man named Titus to the footsteps of Jerusalem, to tell the Jews, get out, we're taking your city. Well, Jerusalem didn't want any part of that. So Titus camps his entire army around the city and says, okay, we're going to camp around the city. You're not going to bring any food in. So eventually you're going to starve, so you need to leave. Jerusalem still doesn't budge. Titus even goes so far as to allow pilgrims in the city. He tricks pilgrims to say, yes, it's a religious holiday. Come into the city, pay your tithes, pay your whatever, and then you can leave. He let them in the city, and then he would not let them leave. And so at every religious holiday, the population of the city would grow exponentially, and the strain on food continued to grow. Jerusalem still wouldn't budge. Titus finally sent a man named Josephus to the city to try to work out a bargain. Now, the name Josephus sounds familiar to us. That's because he's actually the historian that writes about many of the biblical accounts and even verifies the Bible. But Josephus goes to the gates of the city to try to work out a deal. They still say no. And so he says, okay, so Titus decides that he's going to burn down the temple from outside the city. He's going to launch fire into the city to burn down the temple. And unintentionally, he catches a few houses on fire in the process. And then within a few hours, this is the picture of the city. The temple is on fire, as well as an entire half of the city starts to be on fire. At this point, the Roman army is like an animal that smells blood. Titus gives up. He says, I can't hold this army back any longer. And within a day, the Roman army has completely filled the city. And Josephus writes that they became bored when they ran out of people to execute, that there was no one living left in the city, so they just began to tear down every building in the city. Building after building they tore down, and they even burned the forest surrounding the city. This was such a celebrated victory for Rome that in Rome they actually built an arch called the Arch of Titus to celebrate this victory over what they considered to be the horrible people of Jerusalem. And this actually still stands in Rome today. This is the vision that Jesus sees in Luke 19. So let's read Luke 19 together. This is starting in verse 41. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it, and he said, "If you, even you, had only known this day would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and your children within your walls, and they will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." It could be argued that Jerusalem had this coming. You could argue that. You could point to the fact that Jerusalem, even before Christ came, had rejected God. They had stopped a heartfelt worship of their Creator. And then even with God living among them as a man, they still rejected God. So it could be blatantly argued that Jerusalem had the justice of God coming to them. But Jesus' reaction, in spite of this, is somewhat unexpected. Jesus weeps for the city. Now, in their language, which was Koine Greek, which is what the Bible is written in, which is basically fancy for just common Greek. It's what you would say to your neighbor on the street. There are two words for the word weep. One of them means to shed tears quietly, almost reflectively. And the other word means to wail loudly, as if at a funeral. And it's the same word that is used in John 11 when Lazarus' family is wailing at the death of their loved one. This is the language that is used here for Jesus weeping over what will happen to the city. Jesus weeps over the lost city of Jerusalem as if a father would weep over losing a wife or a mother over a child. Now, at the beginning, we mentioned we were going to discuss a couple different cities, but we also said that there would be a third city that we would mention today. And this city is not in the biblical text, but it's a city that's very familiar to all of us. The third city we're going to discuss today is Fulton, New York. Now, this city, like Nineveh, like Jerusalem, is very meaningful to God. The city is very important to God. The people of the city are very important to God. And I believe that a prophet has been sent to this city. And I would like to believe, and I do believe, that that prophet is the body of believers at Fulton Alliance Church. I believe that we are called to be Christ to our city. So before we ask ourselves what we are doing to reach this city, what we are saying to this city, I would ask us how we feel about our city. And if we view the members of our city the way that Christ viewed Jerusalem. There are a few things I'm going to mention about Fulton first. Fulton is a city of 11,147 residents. Almost 1 in 5 residents of the city live in poverty. That's not to say poor, that's to say in poverty. Slightly more than 1 in 5 adults over 25 have never graduated high school. And in almost every meaningful financial or educational statistic, Fulton is worse than the national average. Now, I want to be sensitive in saying this so you understand. This is not meant to say this to in any way insult or put down the city, to put down the population of the city. This is simply to highlight the fact that Fulton is broken and has needs. And it is broken in different ways than Nineveh was, in different ways than Jerusalem was, but it is still broken. Now, the morality of the city, only 38% of the population of this city attend church. That means that 62% of the residents in our city do not belong to a body of believers. That would be 6,911 people in this city. And if the change that occurred between the year 2000 and the year 2008 has continued in that path, we could say that over 7,000 residents of our city are not at church today. And it's not because they're on vacation. They're also not going to be at church the next week either. Now, we as a church have said, admittedly, that we want to grow into our community. And it would be overly harsh to say or assume that we feel about our neighbors with the same animosity that Jonah felt toward Nineveh. But I believe it would also be equally presumptuous to say that we collectively see Fulton with the same compassion, the same heart, and the same awareness that Christ did. But if we're not careful, our inability to be comfortable around, and by comfortable I don't mean that we have to approve of every action, but if we're not able to be comfortable around all of those we are surrounded by, it will affect our ability to see them the way that Christ sees them. Philippians chapter 2, if you want to look there. Philippians chapter 2, verse 5 says that we are to let our attitude be the same as that of Christ Jesus. Now, we as a church have become pretty good at, for the most part, acting like Christ. And in a lot of ways, I believe that it's easier to act like Christ than it is to think and feel like Christ. For example, I can make myself eat an olive. Now, the Seymours, I eat with them frequently. They always try to make me eat olives. I hate olives. They sneak it in my food. They'll cut them up real small so I don't really notice them. But then I get an olive in my mouth and it tastes like I'm licking a shoe. And I hate it. Now, that said, I can eat an olive. Absolutely can. If you were to right now tell me, Charles, you have to eat an olive. You have to eat an entire bowl of olives. You have to do it. I would say, okay, and I could do it. I could absolutely do it. But I'll tell you what, if you give me some strawberries, I can eat strawberries. I can eat every strawberry you give me, and then when you are not looking and are distracted, I can eat the strawberries you have saved for yourself. And I can eat them with a joyful heart. In both scenarios, you could say, well, Charles, you did the same thing. You accomplished the same thing. But how much easier is it to do something when we are excited about that, what we are doing? So how do we make ourselves then think differently about our neighbors? How do we make ourselves see them the way Christ sees them? There are a few things I think we have to do. First, we have to eliminate our mindset of us and them. We are not at war with the lost. I want to repeat that. We are not at war with the lost. And to use a sports analogy, they are not the other team. You could, in a sense, say they are the trophy. But sometimes our communication and our language we use for our neighbors causes a disconnect between us and them. We're so quick to use language like wicked, evil, heathen, lazy. We have this plethora of vocabulary we use to describe those that are not among us. And we often, even myself, can slip into that. But I want to take a look at Christ's example. In Luke chapter 15, how does Christ describe the lost? And Jesus' language for the lost are this. He says they are a sheep that need a shepherd. He says they're a coin of great value that needs found. He refers to them as a beloved son who needs to return home. Also, to eliminate our view of us and them, I think we also have to come to a healthy understanding that we are exactly like them. We are like them in every way but Jesus. Jesus Christ is the only difference between what we would say as us and them. And you might say, well, now hold on a second. Now wait. I was watching YNN the other night, and there was a story about a man that walked into a convenience store, and at gunpoint, he went to the cash register, put a gun in the man's face, told him to give him all of his money. The man, scared for his life, hands him all his money. He puts it in a bag and runs out the store. You're telling me that I am just like that man? And I would say, absolutely, we are just like that man. Because how often are we tempted in things like we'll sit at home on our computer, we'll be shopping for music, we'll decide the album costs too much. So what do? We can just download it illegally. We can pirate it. And it's okay because we can rationalize to ourselves that it costs too much. The musicians are multimillionaires. What is my dollar going to matter if I buy this song legally? So what ends up happening is we commit the same sin. But the difference is that we are forgiven and we have Christ. Romans chapter 2 says that now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based on truth. So when you, a mere man, pass judgment on them, and yet you do the same things, do you think you will escape judgment? Now, this passage is not meant to overly discourage us, but it's just meant to bring us to an understanding that we are them, but we are recreated in Christ. There is only one image of God. There is only one image of God. And the exact same image of God that was used to create us was used to create them. So we have to eliminate that mindset. Secondly, we have to accept responsibility for the state of our city. And this is admittedly difficult at times, I understand. But I heard a man the other day in a conversation, and I'm just going to quote him. This is what he said. He was talking with two of his friends, and he said that America is headed for hell in a handbasket. And then he went on to discuss all the groups of people, all the social groups, all the different types of people that were wrecking it for us, that were just ruining everything for the believers. Now, what this highlighted to me is that I don't think we understand that the responsibility for our country, for our state, for our city, for our workplace, even for the street we live on, falls upon us. And when that takes place, in a world where sin is a problem, the lost become a very easy target. And then we become just like Israel in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, Israel, which Israel represents the believers of God, not simply a nation, but the believers of God, would constantly find themselves at odds with the Philistines, with the Ninevites, with the Moabites, with the Babylonians. And constantly, every time, while they're crying out to be saved from these wicked people, there are two truths that remain. First of all, God is not shy in pointing out that those nations are sinful. He's not shy in it. He readily admits it. He says, you're right, they are sinful. But Israel is very wrong in one place. He says, what you do not understand is the reason you are struggling is your sin. And just as quickly as you can look at Philistia and say, wow, what terrible people, they could just as easily right now look to you and point out your sin. And so what Israel did not do is Israel did not understand that from the beginning of time, their obligation was not to simply recognize the sin of those around them. Their responsibility was to change the culture around them. And from the dawn of creation, God's desire has been that every man and every nation know him. And it takes Israel about 2,000 years before they get that they're not just supposed to complain about the stuff around them, they're supposed to change the people around them. Isaiah chapter 42, verse 6 says, I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles. Isaiah 49:6, I will make you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the very ends of the earth. So what Israel couldn't grasp is that they were not willing to, when they looked at the world around them, to quit blaming everyone else and understand that all this is doing, all that blaming is doing, is building a resentment in Israel toward the people around them, because they weren't willing to accept responsibility for the state of their world. The city of Fulton should be seen then as our responsibility. This means that we are on the front line to be a voice for the poor, to be a resource for the uneducated, and most importantly, to be a place for rescue and recovery for any person that seeks salvation. Lastly, we have to train our heart to break. Again, we mentioned earlier, Jerusalem, you could incredibly argue, got what it had coming. We mentioned that the sinfulness of the city does disgust God. We're not debating that. And justice is poured out. We're also not saying that justice will not be poured out. But the characteristic that Jesus exhibits is mind-blowing. You know, Jesus had 3 things he had to accomplish when he came to the earth. 3 things. First of all, Jesus had to be sinless. He had to be perfect. He had to live a perfect life. In addition to that, Jesus had to preach the gospel. He had to preach the kingdom coming. And then beyond that, Jesus had to become a place for salvation from our sin. And he did this by dying and resurrecting. These are the things that Jesus had to accomplish. And so the fact that Jesus has this characteristic of his personality that is not even required of him tells me that this must be something that is just indivisibly tied into his nature of who he is. And so when you look in the Old Testament, you ask yourself, is this a new thing? And I don't believe it is. Ezekiel 33, say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather they turn from their ways and live. This passage in Ezekiel 33 lets us know that it is not some new addition to God's character. Justice has always been and will always be part of God's character, but so has compassion. And unfortunately, when we long for the wicked to get what they have coming, or when we say things like, the poor around us just don't work hard enough, when we develop those attitudes to these groups of people, we effectively say, we're giving up on you. Jesus knew that justice was coming, but he never celebrated it. If anything, the justice of God being poured out on those people that were unrepentant and did not know him was something that broke Christ's heart. It broke his heart. A heart that is like Christ is one that breaks for the lost, not one that simply is inconvenienced by them. So I want to tell a story from my life. When I was 16 years old, well, first of all, I grew up in a poor area. I grew up in a poor neighborhood. But for the most part, we all got along, and it was good. I mean, we liked our neighbors. They liked us. But when I was 16 years old, there was a family that moved into a house right across the street. It was a single mother and 2 daughters. One daughter was 15, the other one was 13. And from day one, they completely changed the dynamic of our neighborhood. Every day, it seemed, there was a patrol car at their house. The mother constantly had a new man in every week. There was a new man living with them. The oldest daughter, who was 15, would constantly ask me for rides. It seemed like every time I was leaving somewhere, she would just say, I just want to leave. Can you give me a ride somewhere? Where are you going? You're going to the mall? I'll go to the mall. I'll find something to buy there. I don't really have a lot of money, but I'll walk around. I won't be annoying, I promise. And I would just always have a reason to say, no. And to me, in my mind, these neighbors became a drain on me. Yeah, I loved them. I'd say it. I loved them. But they were a nuisance. And unfortunately, what ended up happening is instead of having a healthy, compassionate heart like Christ did toward them, I was just ready for them to move. I was ready. And then 5 months later, they were evicted because they couldn't pay the rent. And then in that moment, I breathed a sigh of relief. We have our neighborhood back. That's what I felt. We have our neighborhood back. Well, about 5 years later, 6 years later, I was in my hometown visiting. And I ran into the youngest daughter, the one that was about 13. And I didn't recognize her at all, but she recognized me. She came to me, and she said, "Charles." And I didn't know who she was. I asked who she was, and she told me. And I remembered. I said, "Oh, okay, I remember. I remember." And just trying to start conversation, I didn't know what to say. I said, "Well, how's your family? You all weren't there very long, but how's everyone doing?" And what she said, I can't ever forget. She said, "Well, we were evicted because my mother was arrested for selling cocaine out of the house. She struggled financially, and she just was helpless. And she felt this was the only way to make ends meet. And so she was arrested. When she was arrested, my older sister ran away, and we've never heard from her since. We have no idea where she's at. In addition to my mother being incarcerated and my older sister disappearing, I can at least say that I'm doing okay." And for a moment, I had a glimmer. I said, "Well, okay, what are you doing now?" She said, "Well, I have a little apartment, and I've got a job, and I'm working at Southern Exposure as an exotic dancer." And in that moment, everything inside of me dropped, because I realized when they moved out, I got exactly what I wanted. We got our neighborhood back. The people that were just wrecking it for us were finally gone. We could celebrate our peaceful Christian neighborhood. But in the moment that happened, that's what happened to their life. And it took this little girl to remind me that. I said earlier that we had mentioned Nineveh again, and we will. Nineveh was saved for one generation. Jonah did his job, and then he left. And so for one generation, Nineveh was a powerful city for God. But the problem is even though Leviticus 19 clearly states that when any person, a foreigner, comes to you to become a worshiper of God, you were to treat them exactly as if they are a native-born Israelite. This never happened. Jonah's dislike of Nineveh affected the way he treated them even after they had confessed sin. And so Nineveh was never assimilated into the kingdom. Nineveh was never considered a city of Israel. And so for one generation, Nineveh was saved. And then from that day forward, Nineveh goes exactly back to where it was. And to this day, there has not been a strong presence for God in that city ever since. Now, Nineveh was preached to, but Nineveh was not cared about, and Nineveh was not loved. And our city and our neighbors need more than just preaching. Our neighbors and the people on our streets need our community, they need our awareness, and they need our friendship as much as anything. So if the musicians will come on up, we're going to sing a song to close with. And as we go through this week, I hope we take an opportunity to, in every situation that we see someone, to ask ourselves a question. Am I allowing myself to see this person, this sinner, this lost person, exactly as Christ sees them? Or am I allowing my frustrations, my discomfort, my lack of ability to love that person affect the way I see them? Now, when we're done today, as he mentioned earlier, the prayer room right through here is open. It's open every Sunday. And I would encourage you, if you feel like, yeah, man, I've got a couple neighbors that when I see them, I know I don't think the right things. I need to pray for that. I would encourage you to utilize that today. And if you want to, even just to stay here in the sanctuary, I'll leave it open as long as you need. So let's stand together, and we're going to sing a song together, and then we'll close in prayer.
Create